The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Hachita, New Mexico territory as Garrett Nash stumbled through the door of Doc Wilson's office, his shirt stained crimson and his eyes wild with fear. In his arms, he cradled a bundle wrapped in a tattered shawl, the weak cries barely audible over his labored breathing. "Help her," Garrett pleaded, his voice cracking. "My wife, she's gone. But the baby, please, document." It was the spring of 1877, and Garrett Nash had just become both a father and a widower in the same terrible night. Doc Wilson's weathered face softened as he took the newborn from Garrett's trembling hands. "Let me see the little one," he murmured, carefully unwrapping the infant. "A girl, by the looks of it." Garrett could only nod, his tall frame slumping against the doorframe. At 26, the former cavalry soldier had seen his share of death during the recent conflicts with Apache raiders, but nothing had prepared him for this. Margaret, his beloved wife of 2 years, had gone into labor 3 weeks early. By the time he'd ridden the 10 miles from their homestead to Hachita, she had bled too much. "The little one seems healthy enough, considering," Doc Wilson said, checking the baby's breathing. "But she'll need milk and proper care." "I don't know the first thing about babies," Garrett admitted, his voice hollow. Doc Wilson carefully placed the infant in a small wooden crib he kept for such emergencies. "There's a wet nurse in town. Widow Mendoza lost her own baby last month. She might help." Garrett nodded absently, his gaze fixed on his daughter's tiny face. She had Margaret's nose, he thought, the same delicate curve. Fresh grief washed over him, and he sank into a chair beside the crib. "I'll send for Mrs. Mendoza," Doc Wilson said, patting Garrett's shoulder. "You stay with your daughter." Outside the doctor's office, the news of Margaret Nash's death and the orphaned baby spread through Hachita like wildfire. By nightfall, it reached the modest home at the edge of town where Madeline O'Malley had taken up residence just 3 months prior. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Peterson said, setting down her teacup. As the wife of the general store owner, she was Hachita's chief purveyor of news. "Poor Mr. Nash. They say he hasn't left that baby's side since he brought her in." Madeline listened quietly, her green eyes thoughtful. At 23, she had come to Hachita seeking a fresh start after her father's death back in Boston. Teaching at the small schoolhouse provided her with a modest living, but the isolation of the frontier town sometimes weighed heavily on her. "Someone should check on him," Madeline said finally. "Bring him some food, at least." Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. "That's Christian charity, Miss O'Malley. I'll pack up some stew." That night, Madeline approached Doc Wilson's office carrying a basket with bread, stew, and a flask of coffee. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of a broad-shouldered man slumped in a chair beside a small crib, his head bowed as if in prayer. She hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain. She'd only seen Garrett Nash from a distance since her arrival in Hachita, a quiet, serious man who rarely came to town except for supplies. The schoolmarm and the reclusive homesteader had never exchanged more than passing nods. Gathering her courage, she knocked softly. When Garrett opened the door, Madeline was struck by the raw grief etched into his features. His dark hair was disheveled, his blue eyes red-rimmed, his usually clean-shaven face shadowed with stubble. "Miss O'Malley," he said, recognition flickering in his eyes. "What brings you here?" "I thought you might need something to eat, Mr. Nash," she said, offering the basket. "I'm very sorry about your wife." Something shifted in his expression, gratitude, perhaps, or simply surprise at the kindness. "Thank you," he said, taking the basket. Would you like to see her?" "The baby, I mean." The invitation surprised her, but Madeline nodded and followed him inside. In the crib lay a tiny infant, her face peaceful in sleep. "She's beautiful," Madeline whispered. "Does she have a name?" Garrett shook his head. "Margaret and we hadn't decided." His voice caught. "She thought we had more time." "Mrs. Mendoza will be here in the morning," Doc Wilson said, emerging from his back room. "She's agreed to nurse the child until other arrangements can be made." "I'm not making other arrangements," Garrett said firmly. "She's my daughter." Doc Wilson exchanged a glance with Madeline. "Garrett, a man alone can't raise an infant, especially not out at that isolated homestead." "I'll manage," Garrett insisted, his jaw set stubbornly. Madeline found herself speaking before she could reconsider. "Perhaps I could help. I could come by after school, show you how to care for her." Both men turned to her in surprise. "You know about babies, Miss O'Malley?" Doc Wilson asked. "I helped raise my younger siblings after our mother died," she explained. "I'm no expert, but I know the basics." Garrett studied her face for a long moment. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Madeline met his gaze steadily. "Because no one should face something like this alone, Mr. Nash." Something in his posture softened slightly. "Call me Garrett," he said. "And thank you. I'd be grateful for any help." That night, after Garrett finally consumed some of the food she'd brought, Madeline left Doc Wilson's office with a promise to return the next day. As she walked back to her small rented room, she glanced back to see Garrett once again sitting vigilant beside his daughter's crib, his silhouette visible through the window. On an impulse, she paused in the shadows across the street, watching as Doc Wilson tried unsuccessfully to convince Garrett to rest. The grieving man simply shook his head, his attention never leaving the sleeping infant. And so began a pattern that would continue for many nights to come. Garrett sat beside the crib every night, and Madeline waited outside till he fell asleep, keeping a silent vigil of her own. For the first week, the baby stayed at Doc Wilson's office. Mrs. Mendoza came 3 times daily to nurse her, while Garrett refused to leave her side except to make funeral arrangements for Margaret. The townsfolk of Hachita came together to help, as frontier communities often did in times of tragedy. The men dug a grave in the small cemetery, while the women prepared food and gathered clothes for the infant. On the 3rd day, Madeline arrived to find Garrett gently bathing his daughter in a small basin, his large hands surprisingly delicate as they supported the baby's head. "Hope," he said without looking up. "I'm naming her Hope." Madeline smiled. "It suits her. Margaret always said hope was what brought us west," he explained. "Hope for something better." Madeline watched as he carefully dried the infant and swaddled her in a clean blanket. His tenderness with the child revealed a side of him the town rarely saw. "You're good with her," she observed. Garrett looked up, a flicker of pride momentarily replacing the grief in his eyes. "I'm learning." By the end of the week, Garrett had decided to return to his homestead with Hope. "You can't be serious," Doc Wilson protested. "That baby needs consistent care. Mrs. Mendoza can't ride out to your place 3 times a day." "I've worked it out," Garrett said firmly. "Mrs. Mendoza has agreed to provide milk that I can take home. I've modified a goat's teat for feeding. And when you need to work the land, when you need to sleep," the doctor pressed. "I'll manage," Garrett insisted, the stubborn set of his jaw brooking no argument. Madeline, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "I'll ride out after school each day," she offered. "I can help with Hope until sundown." Garrett turned to her, surprise evident on his face. "That's a 5-mile ride each way, Miss O'Malley. I can't ask that of you." "You didn't ask. I offered," she replied simply. "And I believe I told you to call me Madeline." Something shifted in his eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or the first tentative thread of connection since his world had shattered. "Thank you, Madeline," he said softly. And so began their arrangement. Each day after the schoolhouse emptied, Madeline would mount her mare and ride to the Nash homestead. The property sat in a small valley with a creek running through it, modest but promising, with a sturdy cabin, a corral for horses, and fields Garrett had been cultivating. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a table with chairs, and a small sitting area. A curtain partitioned off Garrett's sleeping area, while a second small room intended eventually for Hope remained mostly empty except for a handmade crib Garrett had crafted in the days following Margaret's death. Despite her daily visits, Madeline couldn't help worrying about Garrett and Hope during the nights. So, after the first week of their arrangement, she found herself riding back to the homestead after dark, just to check on them. She didn't intend to intrude, merely to reassure herself that all was well. What she saw through the window stopped her in her tracks. Garrett sat in a rocking chair beside Hope's crib, reading aloud from a worn Bible. His deep voice carried softly through the partially open window as he read stories of faith and perseverance. When Hope began to fuss, he set the Bible aside and lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest while humming a tune Madeline didn't recognize. She should have left then, aware she was witnessing a private moment. Instead, she found herself settling in the shadows of a large oak tree, listening as Garrett spoke to his daughter about her mother, promising the infant that he would tell her everything about Margaret as she grew. She had the most beautiful singing voice, Garrett whispered, unaware of his audience. And she could grow anything. Hope. Come spring, I'll show you her garden. Only when Hope had fallen asleep and Garrett had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the chair beside the crib did Madeline slip away, her heart aching with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. This pattern continued through April and into May. By day, Madeline helped with Hope's care, teaching Garrett how to change swaddling cloths, check for rashes, and interpret the baby's different cries. By night, she would return quietly, watching from a distance as Garrett tended to his daughter with unwavering devotion, waiting until he fell asleep before riding back to town. One evening in late May, as wildflowers painted the New Mexico landscape in brilliant colors, Madeline arrived to find Garrett splitting wood, his shirt soaked with sweat. Plantings behind, he explained, setting down his axe. With everything that's happened, Madeline nodded, understanding the precarious situation. Without a successful crop, the homestead wouldn't survive the year. Hope is sleeping, Garrett continued. I hate to ask, but could you watch her while I work the fields for a few hours? Of course, Madeline said, dismounting. That's why I'm here. As Garrett headed toward the fields, Madeline settled into the cabin. Hope slept peacefully, allowing Madeline time to look more closely at what had been Margaret Nash's home. On a small shelf near the fireplace sat a daguerreotype of a young woman with a gentle smile. Margaret, Madeline presumed. Beside it was a pressed wildflower in a small frame and a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. When Hope awoke hungry, Madeline warmed the goat's milk Garrett had prepared and fed her using the modified teat, marveling at the baby's strength as she eagerly took her meal. You're a determined little one, aren't you? Madeline murmured, brushing a finger over Hope's downy head. Just like your father. The days lengthened as summer approached. Madeline began bringing books from the school to read to Hope, claiming it was never too early to develop a love of literature. Garrett would often pause in his work to listen, a faint smile softening his features as Madeline's animated voice filled the cabin. One afternoon in early June, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in while Madeline was at the homestead. The sky darkened ominously, and lightning split the horizon. You can't ride back in this, Garrett said firmly as rain began lashing against the windows. It's not safe. Madeline hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of staying overnight, even under such circumstances. The town will talk, she said softly. Garrett's expression hardened slightly. Let them. I won't risk your safety for gossip. The storm intensified, making the decision for her. Garrett arranged blankets near the fireplace, insisting Madeline take his bed while he slept in the main room near Hope's crib. As night fell and the storm raged, Madeline found herself unable to sleep, listening to the familiar sounds of Garrett speaking softly to Hope, changing her, feeding her the milk they'd prepared earlier. Your mother loved nights like this, she heard him say. Said it reminded her that even the sky needs to cry sometimes. Eventually, as had become his custom, Garrett fell asleep in the chair beside Hope's crib. Madeline slipped from the bedroom to check on them, finding both father and daughter sleeping peacefully. She carefully draped an extra blanket over Garrett's shoulders before returning to bed. When she awoke the next morning, Garrett was already outside, tending to the animals. Hope was awake but content in her crib, studying her own fingers with fascination. Good morning, sweet girl, Madeline said, lifting the baby. Shall we make breakfast for your father? By the time Garrett returned, Madeline had prepared a simple meal of cornbread and coffee. He paused in the doorway, watching as she moved around his kitchen with Hope on her hip. You didn't have to do that, he said, removing his hat. I wanted to, she replied simply, to thank you for your hospitality. They ate together, the domesticity of the scene not lost on either of them. When it was time for Madeline to leave, Garrett walked her to her horse. The school term ends soon, doesn't it? He asked, helping her mount. Madeline nodded. Next week. Will you be returning to Boston for the summer? The question caught her off guard. No, she said. Hachita is my home now. Something like relief flashed in his eyes. I'm glad, he said quietly. Hope would miss you. Only Hope, she thought as she rode away. But she found herself smiling nonetheless. As summer settled over the New Mexico territory, bringing scorching days and brief, violent thunderstorms, Madeline's visits to the Nash homestead increased. With school out of session, she often arrived in the morning and stayed until dusk, helping with Hope and taking on other household tasks. She planted a small vegetable garden beside Margaret's flower beds, mended Garrett's shirts, and even assisted with some of the lighter farm work. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Gossip swirled through Hachita about the schoolmarm spending her days with the widower and his baby. Some of the talk was benevolent, acknowledging Garrett's need for help with an infant. Some was more pointed, questioning Madeline's propriety. "You shouldn't worry about idle gossip," Mrs. Peterson told her one day at the general store. "What you're doing is a Christian kindness." Madeline merely nodded, unwilling to examine too closely her motivations for visiting the Nash homestead. She told herself it was for Hope's sake, the baby girl who had begun to recognize her, who cooed when she entered the room, whose tiny fingers would wrap trustingly around Madeline's own. But there were moments fleeting, unexpected, when Garrett would say something that made her laugh, or when their hands would brush as they both reached for Hope, or when she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. In those moments, Madeline acknowledged a truth she kept carefully guarded. Her feelings for Garrett Nash had grown beyond simple Christian charity. One evening in late July, as Madeline prepared to leave, Garrett cleared his throat awkwardly. "There's a social at the church next Saturday," he said, adjusting Hope in his arms. "For Independence Day." Madeline nodded, waiting. "I thought. That is, Hope and I thought." He took a breath. "Would you like to attend with us? As our guest?" It would be Garrett's first social event since Margaret's death, and the significance wasn't lost on Madeline. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" she asked gently. Garrett looked down at Hope, then back at Madeline. "No," he admitted. "But Hope should be around other people, and I can't hide out here forever." "Then I'd be honored to accompany you both," Madeline said, her heart beating a little faster. The 4th of July social at Hachita's small church was the community's main summer gathering. Tables laden with food lined the churchyard. Bunting in patriotic colors decorated the porch, and someone had brought a fiddle for dancing later. When Garrett's wagon pulled up with Madeline beside him and Hope securely cradled in her arms, a momentary hush fell over the nearest group of townspeople. Then Doc Wilson stepped forward, clapping Garrett on the shoulder. "Good to see you in town, Nash," he said warmly. "And this must be little Hope. My, how she's grown." The ice broken, others came forward to greet them. The women cooed over Hope, praising her healthy appearance and Garrett's dedication. If some cast speculative glances between Garrett and Madeline, neither acknowledged it. As the afternoon progressed, Madeline noticed Garrett growing tenser, his responses becoming more clipped. After he abruptly walked away from a conversation with the blacksmith, she found him standing alone at the edge of the churchyard, his expression strained. "Would you like to leave?" she asked softly, joining him. Garrett shook his head. "I'm sorry. It's just, Margaret loved these gatherings. She knew everyone, talked to everyone. I keep expecting to turn around and see her." Madeline's heart ached for him. "It's all right to miss her, Garrett." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "You've been a godsend these past months, Madeline. I don't know how Hope and I would have managed without you." Before she could respond, Hope began to fuss in her arms. "I think someone's ready for her dinner," Madeline said, grateful for the interruption. "I'll get the wagon," Garrett said, clearly relieved to have a reason to depart. As they rode back to the homestead, Hope fell asleep against Madeline's chest. The sunset painted the landscape in golds and pinks, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and summer dust. "Will you stay for supper?" Garrett asked as they approached the cabin. "As thanks for today." Madeline agreed, and they settled into what had become a familiar routine. Garrett building up the fire while Madeline prepared a simple meal, Hope sleeping contentedly in her crib. They ate together at the small table, their conversation easy after months of shared daily tasks. As darkness fell, Madeline knew she should leave, but found herself reluctant. "I could stay a little longer," she offered. "Help put Hope down for the night." Garrett nodded, a flash of gratitude in his eyes. When Hope awoke hungry an hour later, Madeline prepared her milk while Garrett changed her swaddling clothes. They worked together seamlessly, like a well-practiced dance. Afterward, Garrett sat in his usual chair beside the crib, but instead of reading from the Bible, he began to tell Hope a story about a brave princess who lived in a castle far away. "That's a lovely story," Madeline said when he finished, Hope already drifting back to sleep. "Margaret made it up," Garrett admitted. "She had dozens of stories like that. I'm trying to remember them all for Hope." The raw vulnerability in his voice touched Madeline deeply. "You're a wonderful father, Garrett." He shook his head slightly. "I'm just trying my best. Some days I'm not sure it's enough." "It is," she assured him. "More than enough." The intimacy of the moment stretched between them, fragile and new. Madeline knew she should leave, that staying any longer would only feed the town's gossip. But as Garrett looked at her, something in his expression made her breath catch. "I should go," she said reluctantly. Garrett stood. "I'll saddle your horse." Outside, the night was alive with stars, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the velvet sky. As Garrett helped Madeline mount, his hands lingered slightly at her waist. "Thank you," he said simply. "For everything." Madeline nodded, not trusting her voice. Then, gathering her courage, she leaned down and gently kissed his cheek. "Good night, Garrett." She rode away quickly, not looking back to see his reaction. But that night, when she returned to keep her silent vigil, she found him sitting on the porch instead of by the crib, his fingers touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. August brought relentless heat that baked the New Mexico earth and tested the endurance of Hachita's residents. Garrett's crops struggled, needing constant attention and every drop of water he could divert from the creek. Hope grew rapidly despite the harsh conditions, beginning to roll over and babble, her personality emerging more each day. Madeline continued her daily visits, but also her nighttime vigils. She told herself it was to ensure Hope's safety, but the truth was more complex. Watching Garrett with his daughter, his tenderness, his unwavering commitment, had awakened feelings in her she'd never experienced before. One scorching afternoon, Madeline arrived to find Garrett looking grim, his shirt soaked with sweat as he worked to repair a breach in the irrigation channel. "The creek's dropping," he explained, wiping his brow. "If I can't get water to the corn, we'll lose it." "How can I help?" Madeline asked, setting down her basket. Garrett hesitated. "It's not women's work." "Neither is raising a child alone, but you're managing that," she countered. "Show me what to do." For the next several hours, they worked side by side under the merciless sun, moving stones and digging channels. Hope napped in a shaded basket nearby, occasionally waking to observe their efforts with solemn eyes. By sunset, they had salvaged the irrigation system, but Madeline's pale skin had suffered. Her face and arms were painfully red, and despite the hat she'd worn, her nose and cheeks had begun to blister. "You're burned," Garrett said, his voice laced with concern. "Come inside." In the cabin, he gently applied a salve of aloe and beeswax to her sunburned skin, his calloused fingers surprisingly soft against her face. "Margaret made this," he explained. "She burned easily, too." The mention of his wife hung in the air between them. Madeline had noticed that Garrett spoke of Margaret more freely now, sharing memories with both Hope and Madeline herself. It seemed a healthy sign, though sometimes Madeline felt a pang of something like jealousy and emotion she immediately chastised herself for. "You must miss her terribly," Madeline said quietly. Garrett's hands stilled against her cheek. "Every day," he admitted, "but differently now. At first, it was like a physical pain, like something had been torn out of me. Now it's quieter." Madeline nodded, understanding. She had felt the same after her father's death, grief evolving from a sharp, overwhelming agony to a more manageable ache. "Hope helps," Garrett continued. "And you?" His eyes met hers. "You've brought life back to this place, Madeline." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment, it seemed he might say more or perhaps do more, but Hope chose that moment to wake, demanding attention. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. As Madeline rode home that night, her sunburned skin tingling, she acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was in love with Garrett Nash. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, someday, he might come to love her too. Her nighttime vigils continued. Sometimes, she would find Garrett reading to Hope or singing softly. Other times, he would talk to the baby about the homestead, about his plans for improvements, about the mother she would never know. Always, he sat beside the crib until exhaustion claimed him, and always, Madeline waited in the shadows until he fell asleep. Late August brought the first hint of autumn to the high desert, cooler nights following the still hot days. Hope continued to thrive, now able to sit up with support and reaching eagerly for objects that caught her attention. Garrett's crops had survived the worst of the summer heat, though the yield would be less than he'd hoped. One evening, as Madeline prepared to leave after spending the day helping Garrett harvest early corn, he surprised her with an invitation. "Sunday is Hope's christening," he said, "at the church in town. I was wondering, would you stand as her godmother?" Madeline's eyes widened. Being named godmother was significant, a formal acknowledgement of her role in Hope's life. "Are you certain? There must be others in town who were closer to Margaret." "Margaret would have wanted someone who loves Hope," Garrett said simply. "That's you." Tears pricked behind Madeline's eyes. "Then I would be honored." Sunday dawned clear and bright, a perfect late summer day. The small church in Hachita was filled with townsfolk who had come to witness Hope Nash's christening and, Madeline suspected, to see how the widower and the schoolmarm would behave together in public. Garrett had polished his boots and wore his best shirt, his dark hair neatly combed. Hope wore a christening gown that Mrs. Peterson had helped fashion from one of Margaret's dresses, a touching tribute that brought tears to Garrett's eyes when he first saw it. Standing beside Garrett at the baptismal font, Madeline held Hope while the preacher performed the ceremony. When asked to name the child's godmother, Garrett's voice was clear and confident as he said, "Miss Madeline O'Malley." Afterward, several families had arranged a small celebration at the church hall. Hope was passed from arms to arms, admired and cooed over by the women of Hachita. Garrett accepted congratulations with growing ease, his initial discomfort in social gatherings gradually diminishing. "You've done wonders with him, Mrs. Peterson murmured to Madeline as they watched Garrett talking with the blacksmith. 6 months ago, he could barely look anyone in the eye. Madeline shook her head. "He's done it himself. For Hope. For Hope. And perhaps for someone else as well," Mrs. Peterson said knowingly before moving away to refill the punch bowl. As the gathering wound down, Garrett approached Madeline with Hope sleeping against his shoulder. "Would you ride back with us?" he asked. "There's something I'd like to show you at the homestead." "Curious," Madeline agreed. The ride was peaceful, Hope sleeping soundly in Garrett's arms while Madeline drove the wagon. The afternoon sun gilded the landscape, turning the distant mountains to purple shadows against the azure sky. At the homestead, Garrett handed Hope to Madeline. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into the cabin. When he emerged, he carried a small wooden box. "I made this," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver locket. "It belonged to Margaret. I thought, for Hope's godmother." Madeline gasped softly as Garrett lifted the locket from the box. Inside was a tiny daguerreotype of Hope. "Garrett, I can't accept this," she protested. "It's too precious." "Please," he said, his voice low. "Margaret would have wanted Hope's godmother to have it, and I want you to have it." The weight of what he wasn't saying hung in the air between them. Madeline nodded, turning so he could fasten the locket around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. "Thank you," she whispered, touching the locket. Hope stirred then, breaking the moment. As Madeline handed her back to Garrett, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings neither was quite ready to voice. That night, when Madeline returned for her vigil, she found Garrett sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the stars. "I know you're there, Madeline," he called softly, startling her. "You've been watching over us for months." Caught, Madeline emerged from the shadows, embarrassment heating her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just wanted to make sure you and Hope were all right." Instead of the anger she expected, Garrett's expression held only tenderness. "You should come inside," he said, rather than waiting in the dark. It was an invitation that changed everything. September brought the first frosts to Hachita, turning the landscape golden in the early morning light. Hope celebrated her 6-month birthday, now able to sit without support and babbling constantly in her own private language. The Nash homestead was transformed, as well the cabin cleaner, more organized, with small touches that reflected Madeline's presence. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains at the windows, books stacked beside Garrett's chair. Since the night of the christening, Madeline no longer hid in the shadows. Instead, she would arrive after supper, helping Garrett with Hope's bedtime routine before settling in the main room. Sometimes they talked about books, about Hope's progress, about the homestead's needs for the coming winter. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, Madeline mending or reading while Garrett cleaned his tools or worked on small woodworking projects. Always, Garrett would sit beside Hope's crib until he fell asleep. Always, Madeline would drape a blanket over his shoulders before quietly letting herself out. But now, before she left, Garrett would squeeze her hand in silent thanks, his eyes conveying what neither had yet put into words. The town noticed the change in their relationship. Some approved, seeing it as a natural progression for a widower with a small child. Others thought it too soon after Margaret's death. Madeline tried not to let the whispers bother her, focusing instead on her growing bond with both Garrett and Hope. One crisp October evening, as they sat by the fire after Hope had fallen asleep, Garrett broke their companionable silence. "Winter's coming," he said, his eyes on the flames. "The path to town gets difficult after the first heavy snow." Madeline nodded, understanding the practical challenges the season would bring to their arrangement. "I could stay in town during the week once the weather turns," she suggested. "Visit when conditions allow." Garrett's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been carving a small horse for Hope. "Or you could stay here," he said quietly. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Madeline's heart raced as she carefully considered her response. "That would cause talk," she said finally. "It already does," Garrett pointed out, setting aside his carving. "But that's not what I'm asking." He moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "These past months, you've become essential to us, to Hope, and to me. I know it hasn't been that long since Margaret, but life out here is uncertain. We're not guaranteed tomorrow." Madeline held her breath as he continued. "I'm not asking out of convenience, or just for Hope's sake," Garrett said earnestly. "I'm asking because somewhere along the way, between your daily visits and your nighttime vigils, I found myself falling in love with you, Madeline O'Malley." Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes. "Garrett, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "I know this is sudden. I know there are complications. But I wanted you to know how I feel before winter isolates us." Madeline squeezed his hands, her heart too full for words. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Garrett responded with a tenderness that answered her unspoken concerns. When they parted, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Is that a yes?" "It's a I love you too," Madeline said softly. "The rest we can figure out together." 3 days later, they were married by the preacher in Hachita's small church, with Hope cooing happily in Doc Wilson's arms and most of the town in attendance. Some thought it too soon after Margaret's death. Others considered it perfectly sensible given the approaching winter and Hope's needs. But as Garrett and Madeline exchanged their vows, their eyes fixed only on each other, it was clear to everyone present that this was no mere marriage of convenience. Their first winter as a family tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. November brought early snows that isolated the homestead for days at a time. The school board had reluctantly accepted Madeline's resignation, hiring a replacement from Santa Fe who arrived just before the worst weather set in. Provisions ran low by January, forcing Garrett to make treacherous journeys to town for supplies. But within the cabin's walls, a profound happiness bloomed. Madeline transformed the small room that had been intended as Hope's nursery into a cozy bedroom for the three of them, with Hope's crib beside their bed. Garrett no longer needed to sit vigil by the crib each night, though he often did anyway, reading to Hope before carrying her to the bedroom where Madeline waited. Their nights together were a revelation for both of them, Garrett rediscovering intimacy after months of grief, Madeline experiencing it for the first time. They learned each other slowly, tenderly, building a physical relationship as deep and meaningful as the emotional bond that had drawn them together. By spring, as the snow retreated and wildflowers once again carpeted the New Mexico landscape, another change was evident. Madeline's slender form had begun to round with child. "Are you happy?" Garrett asked one evening, his hand resting on her growing belly as they lay in bed. "Completely," Madeline assured him, covering his hand with her own. "Are you?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I used to think happiness was something you earned," he said finally. "Something you achieved and then held on to. But that's not right. What is it then?" Madeline asked. "It's a gift," he said simply. one that can be taken away at any moment, like it was with Margaret, but also one that can be given again, unexpectedly, like you and Hope. I've learned to accept it with gratitude, however long it lasts. Madeline turned to face him, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. That's very wise, Mr. Nash. I had a good teacher, Mrs. Nash, he replied, pulling her closer. Hope's first birthday arrived with the summer heat, the little girl now toddling around the cabin and yard on unsteady legs, babbling a mixture of real words and her own inventions. Garrett had built her a special chair that sat higher at the table, carved with her name and decorated with painted wildflowers, Madeline's contribution. They held a small celebration at the homestead, inviting Doc Wilson, Mrs. Peterson, and a few others from town who had been supportive during those difficult early months. Hope charmed everyone with her antics, especially her determination to feed herself cake, most of which ended up on her face and dress. As the guests departed, Madeline, now 7 months pregnant, sat on the porch with Hope in her lap, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains with gold and purple. Garrett joined them, settling beside his wife and daughter. Happy? He asked, echoing the question that had become a ritual between them. Very, Madeline confirmed, leaning against his shoulder. Hope patted Madeline's rounded belly. Baby, she declared, one of her newest words. That's right, sweetheart, Madeline said. Your brother or sister is in there. Brother, Garrett predicted, his hand joining Hope's on Madeline's stomach. A boy this time. We'll see, Madeline said, smiling. She had her own predictions, but kept them to herself. As darkness settled over the homestead, they moved inside. Madeline prepared Hope for bed, while Garrett banked the fire for the night. When Hope was tucked into her crib, now moved to her own small room, Garrett sat beside her as he had every night since her birth. Once upon a time, he began, his deep voice soft in the dim light. There was a brave knight who lost his way in a dark forest. Madeline leaned against the doorframe, listening as Garrett wove a tale of loss, hope, and unexpected joy. Their story transformed into a fairy tale for their daughter. When Hope's eyes began to droop, Garrett leaned down to kiss her forehead. Sleep well, my heart, he whispered. Madeline slipped away to their bedroom, giving father and daughter their private moment. She changed into her nightgown, her movements slower now with the weight of her pregnancy, and sat at the small vanity table to brush her hair. In the mirror, she caught sight of the silver locket Garrett had given her on the day of Hope's christening. Inside now were 2 tiny images, Hope on one side, and Margaret on the other. Garrett's idea, a way to honor the woman who had brought them together through her absence. Madeline touched the locket gently, whispering a silent thanks to the woman she had never met, but whose legacy lived on in Hope's smile and Garrett's capacity for love. When Garrett joined her, his face was peaceful. She fell asleep right away, he reported, changing for bed. All that excitement today wore her out. Madeline nodded, setting down her brush. She's growing so fast. Too fast, Garrett agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed. He reached for Madeline's hand, drawing her to sit beside him. I have something for you. From his pocket, he produced a small carved wooden box similar to the one that had held Margaret's locket. Inside was a simple gold band set with a small pearl. It was my mother's, Garrett explained. I asked my brother to send it from back east. I wanted you to have something that was just for you, not connected to our past, but our future. Madeline's eyes filled with tears as Garrett slipped the ring onto her right hand, her left already bearing their wedding band. It's beautiful, she whispered. Like you, Garrett said simply, drawing her into his arms. Later, as Madeline drifted toward sleep in the circle of Garrett's embrace, she felt their unborn child move within her. The sensation reminded her of how much had changed in just over a year, how grief had given way to hope, and hope to joy. I love you, she murmured, feeling Garrett's arms tighten around her in response. And I love you, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. More than I ever thought possible again. In August of 1878, just as the summer heat began to wane, Madeline went into labor. Unlike Margaret's tragic experience, Madeline's proceeded normally, though not without the pain and fear that accompanied all births in that era before modern medicine. Garrett had sent for both Doc Wilson and Mrs. Peterson as soon as Madeline's pains began. While they awaited help, He did his best to keep Hope entertained and away from the bedroom where Madeline labored, though the little girl seemed to understand something momentous was happening. "Mama hurt?" Hope asked repeatedly, her small face creased with concern. "Mama is working very hard to bring the baby," Garrett explained, holding his daughter close. "But she's strong, like you." When Doc Wilson finally arrived, followed shortly by Mrs. Peterson, Garrett was relegated to the main room with Hope. The hours stretched endlessly as Madeline's cries occasionally penetrated the closed bedroom door. "This is normal," Doc Wilson assured him during one brief emergence to get fresh water. "She's doing well." Still, Garrett couldn't help remembering Margaret, the blood, the panic, the terrible stillness that followed. He held Hope tighter, drawing comfort from her solid warmth and innocent trust. As sunset painted the cabin windows with golden light, a new sound filled the air, the lusty cry of a newborn. Garrett's heart leaped as Doc Wilson appeared in the doorway, his weathered face split by a broad smile. "You have a son, Nash," he announced. "Strong lungs on that boy." Hope clapped her hands at the sound, seemingly undisturbed by the wailing. "Baby," she declared triumphantly. "That's right, sweetheart," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your brother is here." When they were finally allowed into the bedroom, Madeline sat propped against pillows, her face radiant despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, lay a red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair. "Come meet your son," Madeline said softly as Garrett approached with Hope in his arms. Garrett settled Hope carefully beside Madeline before gently taking the newborn. The weight of his son in his arms, the miracle of this new life, brought tears to his eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, counting fingers and toes just as he had done with Hope. "What shall we name him?" Madeline asked, stroking Hope's hair as the little girl examined her new brother with solemn curiosity. Garrett looked at his wife, at the son in his arms, at the daughter who had brought them together. "What do you think of Gabriel?" he suggested. "It means God is my strength." "Gabriel Nash," Madeline tested the name. "I like it. Gabriel James Nash, after your father?" Garrett nodded, touched by her suggestion. "Gabriel James Nash it is." That night, after Mrs. Peterson had helped clean up and Doc Wilson had given final instructions before departing, the Nash family settled into their new configuration. Hope insisted on sleeping in her parents' room, unwilling to be separated from the fascinating newcomer. Garrett arranged her small bed at the foot of theirs, while Gabriel's cradle, crafted months earlier by Garrett's hands, stood beside Madeline. As darkness fell, Garrett found himself once again sitting beside a crib, watching over his child. But now, instead of solitary grief, he was surrounded by family. Madeline dozing in their bed, Hope curled in her small cot, Gabriel sleeping peacefully after his first meal. "Thank you," he whispered to whatever power had brought him through the darkest days to this moment of pure contentment. Madeline stirred, her eyes opening to find Garrett in his familiar posture beside the cradle. "Old habits," she murmured with a fond smile. Garrett nodded. "I sat beside Hope's crib every night because I was afraid she'd stop breathing, afraid I'd fail her, afraid of being alone. Now I sit here in gratitude." Madeline extended her hand, and Garrett moved to sit beside her on the bed, careful not to disturb Hope or Gabriel. "We've come a long way from those first days," Madeline said softly, thinking of the grief-stricken man she'd first glimpsed through Doc Wilson's window, and of her own silent vigils outside the cabin. "You waited outside till I fell asleep," Garrett remembered, stroking her cheek. "For months. I couldn't bear to leave you alone," Madeline admitted, "even though you didn't know I was there." "I think, somehow I did," Garrett said. "I felt less alone, even in those darkest nights." Madeline leaned into his touch. "No more waiting outside," she promised. "No more sitting alone by the crib. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Garrett agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. 5 years later, 1883, the Nash homestead had flourished in the 5 years since Gabriel's birth. What had once been a struggling farm was now a prosperous ranch, with cattle grazing on the expanded property and several hired hands helping with the work. The cabin had been enlarged to accommodate the growing family, with a proper second story added and a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Hope, now 6 years old, raced across the yard with her younger brother Gabriel in hot pursuit. At 5, Gabriel had his father's build and determination, while Hope had inherited her birth mother's gentle spirit combined with Madeline's love of learning. "Don't go past the corral," Madeline called from the porch, where she sat shelling peas with 3-year-old Emma on her lap. The little girl, a perfect blend of Garrett and Madeline with auburn curls and blue eyes, solemnly helped by eating every third pea that was shelled. Inside the house, 1-year-old Thomas napped in a cradle that had held each Nash child in turn, watched over by his father, who was taking a rare afternoon rest after a long morning of ranch work. Garrett still sat beside each child's crib until they fell asleep, a habit that had never faded, though now it was shared with Madeline. Together, they would tell stories, sing songs, and reassure their children that they were loved, protected, and cherished. The tragedy that had brought them together was not forgotten. Margaret's grave in Hachita's cemetery was well tended, visited regularly with fresh wildflowers. Hope knew the story of her birth mother, how brave she had been, how much she had loved Hope even before she was born, how she watched over them all from heaven. In the master bedroom of the Nash home, 2 portraits hung side by side. Margaret Nash, her gentle smile preserved in a daguerreotype taken shortly after her marriage to Garrett, and a family portrait taken on Garrett and Madeline's 5th wedding anniversary, showing the couple surrounded by their 4 children. Life in the New Mexico territory remained challenging. Droughts, harsh winters, occasional conflicts with raiders, and the everyday hardships of frontier life tested their resilience. But within the walls of their home, the Nash family had created something remarkable, a haven of love built on the foundation of grief transformed. One autumn evening, as the children played a board game by the fire under Madeline's supervision, Garrett stood in the doorway watching his family. Hope, growing tall and graceful. Gabriel, serious and thoughtful like his father. Emma, full of mischief and charm. And little Thomas, just beginning to toddle around the furniture. Madeline looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled that same smile that had first brought light back into his darkened world all those years ago. She excused herself from the game and crossed to join him. "Happy?" she asked, slipping her arm around his waist. "Beyond measure," Garrett replied, drawing her close. "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "That night you first kissed my cheek, after the social. I knew then that I would love you for the rest of my life." Madeline's eyes softened, "Even though you weren't ready to admit it." "Even then," he confirmed, "you brought Hope back into my life in more ways than just our daughter." Later that night, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Garrett and Madeline stood together on the porch, looking up at the vast canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon above the New Mexico landscape. "I used to wait out here," Madeline remembered, "watching through the window as you sat beside Hope's crib." Garrett nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "And now we sit together." It was true. Each night, they took turns sitting with each child until sleep came. Garrett still beside the crib for Thomas, Madeline on the edge of Emma's bed, both of them taking turns with Hope and Gabriel, who still sometimes asked for the comfort of a parent's presence. "I think that's what love is," Madeline said softly. "Not just the grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the quiet vigils, the willingness to sit beside someone in their darkest moments and wait, however long it takes, for dawn to break." Garrett turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "You were my dawn," he said simply. "And you were mine," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. Inside, the Nash home settled into nighttime stillness, 4 children sleeping peacefully, watched over by parents who had learned that love could be born from loss, and that joy could grow in the most unlikely soil. Outside, the New Mexico stars witnessed a love that had begun in grief but blossomed into something enduring and true, a love strong enough to transform a solitary vigil into a shared journey, night after night, year after year, for all the days of their lives.